Speed is everything. When the distance between you and your target is fixed, the only way to get to your target sooner is by going faster. Hypersonic flight is going at least 5 times the speed of sound. That is Mach 5 or above. If you're already going at Mach 5, you can go from LA to Washington in about 40 minutes. A hypersonic glide vehicle, shown in red, spends most of its time in the atmosphere. In contrast, an ICBM, shown in blue, goes through the atmosphere on its way up and on its way down. And if you're wondering, the shuttle and the Apollo capsule also only travel through the atmosphere and spend most of their time in space. Traveling through the atmosphere has big advantages. First, as you can see in the diagonal in the figure, a radar can detect an ICBM on its way up. That means that you can detect it. You have time to react. But you can only detect an atmospheric hypersonic vehicle much later in its trajectory, which means much less time to react. In other words, you can't stop what you can't see. Another advantage is the speed itself. Some have called hypersonics the new stealth because the faster you go, the harder you are to catch. And you are traveling in the atmosphere, which means you're maneuverable, which means you can change trajectory. And so you are less predictable than an ICBM. But all of these advantages come at a price. By going so fast in the atmosphere, you are now at the mercy of aerothermodynamics, and the air is not kind to objects ripping through it at hypersonic speeds. My own fascination with going as fast as we can started when I was in elementary school. But when I was 22 years old and literally making my final decision for where to go for grad school, I felt the building rumble at Caltech because their hypersonic tunnel had just gone off, and that was it. I knew that I was going to spend the rest of my career trying to study aerothermodynamics born of hypersonic flight. So it's 20 years later, and I'm still in love, and I'm still chasing solutions to key aerothermodynamic challenges. Predicting drag and heating, measuring the atmospheric environment where these vehicles are going to fly, and creating new diagnostics and sensors to measure what we already know are key flow parameters. For the first challenge, drag and heating, let's look at 2 vehicles. Now, I am a government employee, and so I can't play favorites. So I'm showing you both a Lockheed and a Boeing concept. But if you think back to the Apollo capsule, you immediately see that these vehicles are very different. For these vehicles, high lift and low drag matter. They have wings, and you need to understand how hot their surfaces are going to get at every point of the trajectory, because you don't want to end up like this, a burning meteor, which clearly was not designed by an aerodynamicist. Surprisingly, most of the heating and the drag to a hypersonic vehicle gets set by a thin layer of air that touches the vehicle. We call that thin layer a boundary layer, because it's a boundary between the solid surface of the vehicle and the main airflow around the vehicle. And here's a kick. That thin layer of air can be well organized, what we call laminar, or it can be quite chaotic and disorganized, what we call turbulent. To give you an example, at the end of 1 meter cone, sharp, slender at Mach 5, a laminar boundary layer is 2 millimeters. A turbulent boundary layer is 10 millimeters. If the boundary layer is well organized and laminar, it means less heating, less drag, and so the designers are happy. But of course, laminar boundary layers are prone to disturbances from the atmosphere, from wind tunnels, and eventually they become turbulent. They act as filters. They selectively choose what disturbances to amplify. But we don't want them to become turbulent because a turbulent boundary layer brings with it 3 to 8 times the heating load than a laminar boundary layer had, 3 to 8 times. And if you don't know where in your vehicle that jump is going to happen or how big that jump is, then you are forced to carry margin, which means that you haven't achieved an optimized solution for a vehicle. What you're seeing here is an actual movie taken at a hypersonic wind tunnel at Texas A&M of a canonical geometry. The color denotes temperature, so the hotter it is yellow. And you're looking at the boundary layer getting hotter and hotter as it goes from a laminar state to a turbulent state towards the end of the model and towards the end of the test time. I think intuitively you can guess that the surface beneath a turbulent boundary layer is much hotter than the surface under a laminar boundary layer. So the challenge here is to predict this heating and drag to a vehicle. While we might not have a choice on a boundary layer transitioning from a laminar to a turbulent state, we can try to understand the process from basic principles. And we have 2 teams. One is going to fly this geometry next year, and another team is flying the same geometry the year after, so that we can test our hypotheses against flight data, which actually is very rare. The second challenge has to do with measuring the atmospheric environment where we are going to fly. Some have called the range of altitudes where we're going to fly the ignorosphere, because it's higher than where commercial or military airplanes fly, and it's of not great concern to space weather or satellite. But think about this. For some shapes, it is disturbances in the centimeter or millimeter scale, either in the density, the pressure, the velocity field in the atmosphere, that make a boundary layer trip to turbulent. Now, do you think that atmospheric scientists worried about predicting hurricanes and tornadoes for us care about centimeter scales? No, because hurricanes and tornadoes are measuring hundreds of meters or kilometers. Particulates are another concern, regardless of whether they're man-made or natural. We know that particulates are very good trips of the boundary layer. Some scientists think that it's going to be particulates the main cause to trip us and to give us higher heating in flight. And finally, raindrops coming at you on your way up or your way down at supersonic speeds or higher can cause a lot of damage. Personally, I think they shouldn't be called raindrops anymore. It's a water attack in your vehicle. And so the challenge is to integrate what we know of atmospheric turbulence, shown in the left, into our highest fidelity calculations. So we have 2 teams, 2 multidisciplinary teams, deploying high-altitude balloons all over the United States right now, because they're trying to bring down these atmospheric models to the millimeter, centimeter scale that we need, while at the same time, we are trying to adapt our high computations so that they can talk and they can get this information from the atmospheric models for new simulations of hypersonic flow. And the last challenge is how to create measurements, how to create diagnostics, because optical diagnostics and sensors are our eyes and ears into hypersonic flow. The problem is that the wind tunnels provide a very harsh environment. So you see I'm petite, and this allowed me to fit in the test section of the hypersonic wind tunnel where I completed about 200 rounds to do my PhD, which held a record for many years. I am also the first woman that got a PhD in that lab, and 20 years later, there is another woman in the pipeline, and she's going to get her PhD in a couple of years, after 20 years. Anyways, after every test, which lasted 1 millisecond, I open the wind tunnel and I climb into that test section to inspect the model. Many times to find out that these sensors that I had carefully manufactured, and I promise you I had carefully manufactured them, and I had put them into the model, they had died. Or that particulates coming at the model at Mach 5.5 had pitted the model, and I had to either repolish it or take it and send it to the machine shop so that they could remachine it. With all these challenges, it's not easy to just take any technique that works in subsonic flow and take it to a hypersonic environment. So most of the time, we either have to invent new techniques or we have to heavily adapt techniques that work well at subsonic flow. Good news, a few years back, a young professor invented a new technique to measure velocity in a Mach 10 flow. So he's measuring speeds of more than 1 kilometer per second. And it's no exaggeration to tell you that the community had been waiting for such innovation for about 40 years. Next, we want to measure gas composition at hundreds of kilohertz, and we want to make even simpler measurements in flight. So let's go back to the beginning. Speed is everything, because any nation that has an atmospheric hypersonic vehicle can reach targets faster and with less detection. Yes, the problems that I mentioned are hard, and oh, by the way, they're old too. But as we speak right now, we have teams of brilliant people with critical mass, working in the lab, working in the field, working in front of their computers, asking the right questions and finding answers. So I am convinced that we are in the right path to clear any aerothermodynamic challenges to confidently fly in the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds. Thank you.